Hello, my name is Valerie. One of the readings set for this morning is the story of the feeding of the 5,000. It comes actually in all four Gospels, but I'm going to read the version that St. John gives us in chapter 6. Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming to him. "Where are we going to buy bread?" he said to Philip, "so that they can all have something to eat?" He said this to test him. He himself knew what he intended to do. "Even with 6 months' pay," said Philip, "you wouldn't be able to buy enough bread for each of them to have just a little." One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, joined in. "There's a lad here," he said, "who's got 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what use is that with so many people?" "Make the people sit down," said Jesus. There was a lot of grass where they were, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. So Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and gave them to the people sitting down, then did the same with the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he called the disciples. "Collect up the bits and pieces left over," he said, "so that we don't lose anything." So they collected it up and filled 12 baskets with broken pieces of the 5 barley loaves left behind by the people who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that Jesus had done, they said, "This really is the prophet, the one who was to come into the world." So when Jesus realized that they were intending to come and seize him to make him king, he withdrew again by himself up the mountain. Well, there's a tremendous lot in this story and lots of ways we could approach it. But let's start by looking at some of the characters who appear. Jesus knows the crowds are hungry in more ways than one, as we'll find out. So he starts by asking Philip the obvious question. How are we going to feed all these people? And Philip says, well, it would take a vast amount of money. Quite impossible. They'll have to go home hungry. It doesn't occur to him that Jesus might be able to do anything about a need, that his presence can change the situation. And how often have we reacted to a problem or a scary situation like that? We've left Jesus out of it. Perhaps not even thought to tell him about our fears and worries. We've tried to come up with an answer on our own. Then there's Andrew. He seems to be the sort of person who gets chatting to those around him because he's come across this lad. Perhaps he spotted the boy because he was on his own, and so he asked him who he'd come with, why he'd come to see Jesus, and so on. And the boy proudly shows Andrew the packed lunch that his mum had sent him off with that morning. Andrew goes a bit further than Philip. He doesn't see what Jesus could do about the situation, but at least he tells him about the tiny amount of food that seems to be available. Sometimes that's the best we feel we can do when a seemingly unsurmountable problem looms up. We don't know what Jesus can do about it, but at least we can tell him about it rather than trying to struggle on our own. The one with the most faith seems to be the small boy himself. We can assume that, like all small boys, he's hungry and ready for his lunch, but he's prepared to give it to Jesus if Jesus thinks that'll help. Now there's faith for you. And Jesus takes the little that's offered to him and transforms it so that everyone is fed. Of course, many in the crowd may just have thought, this is great, free lunch. But St. John wants us to understand that what Jesus was doing wasn't what we would call performing a miracle, just doing something amazing, but that his action was meant as a sign. That's the word he uses for all Jesus' mighty acts, meant to point us not only to who Jesus is, but to what he'd come to do and to give to those who follow him. And in this event, he's putting it in terms of bread, of food. We can enjoy a good meal, but we know that very soon we'll be hungry again. No meal, however good, satisfies our bodies for long. But Jesus knows that we all also have an inner hunger that we try to satisfy, but that'll never be truly satisfied if we just search after money, power, status, and possessions. Because none of these ultimately work to fill that gap, that deep inner hunger we all have for something that'll really satisfy us at the deepest level. But I am the bread of life, said Jesus. Anyone who comes to me will never be hungry. But going back to the story, we haven't thought about the crowds themselves. Why were they flocking after Jesus? What were they wanting? Well, they certainly hadn't come just to get a free lunch. They weren't expecting that, though no doubt they thoroughly enjoyed it. Some would be there hoping to be healed. Some would just be curious. Who is this man? Some were perhaps glimpsing that in some way he was offering something that would satisfy their need to feel loved, wanted, special in some way, to have a purpose in life, and they'd never come across anybody like him before. But it does seem as if on this occasion there were a large number of men there in the crowd who had come to believe that Jesus was indeed the Messiah. But they understood that to mean a great leader who would drive out the Roman invaders from the land. So they've come to declare themselves ready to fight in his army and to get him to start the battle now. And right at the end of the story, we read that Jesus had to hurry off to avoid them trying to force him to act as they want. Those men were certainly hungry for change, but they hadn't really listened to what Jesus was offering and were trying to fit him into the mold they wanted him to occupy. Again, a challenge to us to try to hear what Jesus is really saying to us and not what perhaps we'd like him to be saying. There's a lot in this story that we could meditate on during Lent, perhaps. When things get tricky, do we turn to Jesus or try to muddle on without him? How much of what we value are we prepared to trust him with? And are we trying to understand his teaching better? And above all, are we trying to know him better? The one who says, I am the bread of life.